Before we start today's topic, Prism, let's introduce our guests. We have Tala, Song, and Jacob. They are classmates and group partners in Professor Vito's class.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Before we get started, I want to give a brief on the planning tool for resource integration, synchronization, and management, or PRISM, for the listeners. In early June 2013, Edward Snowden, a 29-year-old analyst for the NSA, stole an estimated 1.7 million documents that revealed how the NSA was allowing their analysts to use tools like Xkeyscore to obtain phone records, to search through vast databases containing emails, online chats, and the browsing histories of millions of individuals with no proper authorization to do so. So, Song, what are your thoughts on this? Do you think that since the NSA is part of the government, that they had the right to do this to millions of individuals?
The Constitution, through the Fourth Amendment, protects people from unreasonable searches and seizures by the government. NSA and the other intelligence agencies' digital surveillance activities violate the spirit of Americans' Fourth Amendment by massacring electronic communication data. I believe that government should not be able to conduct electronic surveillance of Americans' communication without a warrant. As Pavildi states, quote, "What constitutes legitimate government surveillance is contentious and constantly evolving. If governments outreach in this domain, they can stymie public debate and freedom of expression," unquote. Any agency wishing to search for Americans' data must get a court approval and a warrant. You should have authorized purpose and reasonable expectation of uncovering evidence of crime. Quote, "The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated," unquote. In the past, people were worried about others entering their house. Now there's a worry about the government invading users' internet privacy and collecting their data. I mean, if the federal agencies have the warrant, then all bets are off the table. They can invade your house and your data. But if there's no warrant, you have the blurred line of, is it okay for the government to invade your privacy?
Now that you mention it, I do remember that in 1967, the U.S. Supreme Court in Katz versus the United States formed a baseline test to determine whether the monitoring of certain communications violated the Fourth Amendment. But I would argue that it tarnishes the spirit of the First Amendment too. The First Amendment states, "Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech." Doesn't this suggest the idea of a free flow of information, and shouldn't Americans have a right to privacy on that too?
Yes, that is a really good point. I do believe that Americans should have their right of privacy and free flow of information. However, the current legislation has not kept up with the speed of modern technology advancing. Updated legislation to keep up with the evolving digital communication technology is a must to protect Americans' right to privacy. And a periodical and systematic review of the current legislation would mitigate such issues we are facing with the outdated legislative interpretation right now.
So given how this is a contested area of legal interpretation, what was the legislative basis for all of this?
Well, starting back a little over 50 years ago, implementations of acts have occurred that allow the government and businesses to further invade Americans' technology, internet, and electronic privacy. Up on the screen, we have a timeline of the major domestic policies and a brief description for the viewers.
What was the overall role of the internet and PRISM in relation to domestic politics?
Legally speaking, digital and telecommunication surveillance programs rely on two key statutes, Section 702 of the FISA and Section 215 of the Patriot Act. The former authorized the collection of communications content under PRISM and other programs, while the latter authorized the collection of metadata from phone companies such as Verizon, Sprint, and AT&T.
Can you explain more about metadata?
Metadata is a set of information about other data which provides one or more aspects of the data, descriptively, administratively, and statistically. For example, if a federal law enforcement agent conducts electronic surveillance on a particular target, a single digital data would affix additional metadata such as who, what, when, where, or why were involved with that particular piece of data.
Oh, that brings up a great point on data versus metadata. For example, data would generally just collect a description or report like a phone call incoming and outgoing. But now with metadata, the government can collect precise data like the timestamp, location, and other detailed information. Overall, the internet has been evolving tremendously. For example, in 2006, CLIO was extended to cover broadband internet and voice over protocol traffic. And even in 2013, the FBI tried to change CLIA even further as they argued that the act was now outdated. This request was sparked by the FBI versus Apple San Bernardino shooting case in which Apple refused to place a backdoor in their products as they argued it was unethical. The FBI argued that it was one phone, but Apple argued if they were able to successfully change the law, they would know how to gain immediate access to all iPhones. This means they would be able to access an end user's FaceTime, social media apps, videos, and all metadata.
Interesting. Who knew? So how is surveillance conducted?
There are two ways to conduct digital surveillance. The first is via Prism, which compels companies to turn over data. The second is by tapping communication traffic through networks. The NSA can only use Prism on non-US citizens. However, after sending the request to FBI, who acts as a middleman and process all requests to individual companies, they can use Prism on US citizens, provided it's in relation to a crime.
Can you tell me about the similarities between surveillance and protests and how internet penetration affects these?
Well, because a lot of surveillance is online or via telecommunication lines, internet penetration actually has a large influence on its effectiveness. This is similar to the effects of internet penetration in autocracies and the level of protests seen. According to Weidman and Rode, political protests were less likely to occur overall in areas of high internet penetration. However, once protest has been sparked, the internet allowed those protests to continue to organize themselves. But most of these effects are primarily seen in urban contexts with high internet penetration. Surveillance requires a certain amount of internet and phone traffic to be effective, also typically seen in these same urban contexts. However, due to the urban contexts, online communications would often also be supplemented by physical networks of relationships which were offline, which would be difficult to observe, meaning that government agents would have to resort to physical surveillance once they exhausted digital means.
So for groups in urban contexts, it looks like the NSA was using digital means of surveillance first before involving agents. Jacob, can you elaborate more on the differences between autocratic and democratic surveillance?
Sure. There were two key differences between democratic and autocratic use of surveillance. The key differences seen was that democratic surveillance programs were intended to remain secret, while the autocratic regimes often let their people know of their surveillance. This difference allowed for different effects up until the revelations. In democratic regimes, internet behavior remained unchanged, while users did not know of the surveillance. People would often search for whatever they wanted without much care for who was collecting their data. However, in autocratic regimes where surveillance was advertised, it created a chilling effect on the internet, as people would often self-censor their own behaviors. For instance, in China, in the late 2000s, cartoon police characters, Cha-Cha and Jing-Jing, were used to remind internet users that their behavior online is monitored on any website that may contain objectionable but not censored material.
Could you explain what you mean by a chilling effect?
They were less likely, internet users that is, to search for or publish certain materials that were known to be offensive to the government. In turn, after the revelation of Prism and other programs, a similar trend followed in the US, where even common websites such as Wikipedia saw fewer searches regarding specific topics that may alert the US government and others to illicit activity as seen in the graph. The desire to keep surveillance activity secret in democratic regimes, while it is actively advertised in autocratic regimes, suggests that they serve different functions. In autocracies, surveillance seems to be much more about proactive control of the populace's behavior online. However, for democracies, it's much more reactionary. They're much more concerned with their national security, and though it may be somewhat unethical to spy on their own people, they want to minimize the impact of their surveillance on the behavior of their people.
Interesting. Moving on to censorship, are there any comparisons you can make to censorship with Prism?
Well, as mentioned previously, surveillance when advertised can create a chilling effect on the internet. This is often utilized by autocratic governments as part of a censorship strategy involving fear. Margaret Roberts also identifies two other censorship strategies often used by governments, namely friction and flooding. Though the surveillance programs weren't intended to censor, the US and other democracies can still use these forms of censorship. Often friction is applied to the internet through courts via takedown notices. If content is deemed to be considered illicit in nature, a court can order it to be removed from the server that is hosting it. This prevents illicit content from spreading quickly through the internet. Finally, various democracies have also pressured search engines and other services to push many varieties of content further down in their search results so that more family-friendly content floods the first batch of results in an efforts to prevent accidental exposure of graphic material to children. However, the impact of this is often considered fairly benign, as with an adaptation of search terms, people can often still get exactly the results that they want. Additionally, some of the disclosures involved in the Prism leak seem to have similar attributes to flooding, as around the time of the reporting on Prism, certain pieces of positive information mysteriously found their way to the press, highlighting how Prism may have thwarted up to 50 potential terrorist attacks.
I see. So how far should governments be able to infringe on liberties to provide for national security?
Well, as Pavaldi says, quote, cybersecurity policy decisions are particularly important because government security agencies benefit from surveillance powers that encroach upon individual privacy, unquote. The pro-sided argument for Prism is that the implementation has helped the government be more effective. It's presented as a solution to terrorism and fear that can occur in America. Well, is getting rid of fear really all for the American people? As Robert says in Censored, quote, fear affects the flow of information by deterring the media or individuals from distributing, analyzing, collecting, or consuming certain types of information, unquote. If Prism reduces the fear in America, wouldn't that just allow for more information to flow for the NSA to access?
Wait, wasn't the general public outraged and even fearful when learning about Prism?
After The Guardian and the Washington Post released articles on the NSA activity, there was a momentary public outrage. But much of this anger has been misdirected towards whistleblowers rather than government itself. This complacency toward government surveillance networks reveals American willingness to forego privacy for the appearance of security, creating a crisis for civil liberties. The public was appeased, media fervor died down, Snowden fled the country, and the NSA quietly returned to its surveillance practices.
As Valerino said in his book Cyber Strategy, quote, the Snowden revelations demonstrated the global surveillance and intrusion capabilities of the Americans to a dramatic degree, unquote. So what effect did this have globally?
On one side, France, Spain, and the European Union spoke to condemn the use of Prism on citizens of the EU. From doing so, the EU created a privacy regulation that would require U.S. companies to clear it with them if the U.S. wanted data on EU citizens. This regulation created a single data protection authority across the EU that declared that there is a right to be forgotten. The U.S. not only failed to adhere to these laws, but there was also a loss of transatlantic trust. Because of this, U.S. companies lost a number of data storage contracts as people moved their data to more secure locations such as the EU. The Taliban claimed that they already knew that this was happening, and they were actively fighting against the intrusions. Russia restricted its government's employees from conducting official business on any U.S.-based social media or email.
When the Brazilian leader at the time, Dilma Rousseff, heard the news about Prism, she canceled her upcoming meeting in Washington and immediately pulled out the $4 billion Boeing contract that she was going to sign with the U.S. She later spoke at the UN General Assembly on how the U.S. surveillance with Prism is a breach on international law. During her speech, she stated, quote, in the absence of the right to privacy, there can be no true freedom or expression and opinion, and therefore no effective democracy. In the absence of the respect for sovereignty, there is no basis for the relationship among nations, unquote. She urged the U.S. to stop as she sees it as the beginning of cyberspace becoming a tool for warfare.
I'm very interested to hear what close allies made of this.
Yeah, they managed to brush off allegations of spying or insisted that Prism did not break their country's laws. New Zealand gave a name to the Five Eyes Alliance, a group composed of the United States, New Zealand, Britain, Canada, and Australia. These countries often claim that they did not spy on their own citizens or non-allied nations, but it turns out that they had other connections of the Five Eyes spy for them and were sent the information. This goes back to the issue of attribution and deterrence. Israel seemed to have helped the U.S. bring Prism to fruition via private companies and did not condemn the U.S.
As we approach the end of our discussion, can you elaborate on any drastic changes that have been sustained to the present? Did any other countries sustain any changes because of it?
In the summer of 2019, it was reported that the NSA was thinking about cutting Prism as it lacked funding and had not been used in 6 months. This may be the case because other NSA programs that the public is not as aware of are being created. It seems that social media companies, as well as media and email companies, were more transparent about their involvement in issues regarding giving the data to the government. Facebook made privacy settings clearer and easier for users to change in an attempt to pacify those enraged by Snowden's leaks. China likely increased its surveillance, seeing the leaks of Prism as a permission to act in the same way. There had not been any other drastic changes in the US or other countries because of this. Like many trending topics, it faded out after media stopped reporting on it.
My next question is, do you think surveillance is going away?
In 2018, the authority to perform surveillance in this manner was renewed with minor reforms, expanding the FISA's reach. It is certainly worth it in one view, as Prism and other surveillance programs have been successful in catching terrorists and stopping terror attacks. The percentage of success is unknown, however. It is clear from continued attempts at passing legislation that calls for backdoors to be placed in technology that surveillance is not dying away. In fact, over the last 5 years, there have been claims that NSA has been encouraging the company, Juniper Networks, to use a weak elliptical curve encryption technology in their routers and a backdoor in their firewalls. Both of these will cause network vulnerabilities that will allow the NSA, even if they're not responsible, to continue surveillance on many companies.
Thank you to Tala, Jacob, and Song for coming today and helping flesh out what we know about Prism. That's all for this week.